Okay, so you're here and ready to get smart fast, and that's what we do, right? Like dive deep into the stuff that matters. And today, oh boy, we're talking about democracy and I guess you could say the state of it around the world. We're using the 2024 Democracy Index from the Economist Intelligence Unit as our guide for this deep dive.
You can think of it as a cheat sheet almost
Yeah.
to understanding why so many people, even when they generally believe in democracy as an ideal, why they're still feeling like it's not working.
Yeah, and the EIU, they don't mess around. They looked at 165 independent countries and 2 territories. So basically, they've got their fingers on the pulse of, well, pretty much the whole planet, right? And they're looking at it through these 5 lenses, like how do elections work? How much choice do people actually have? How well are governments actually functioning, in practice?
Yeah.
How involved are people, the average citizen? Are they engaged? What are the feelings, the attitudes towards politics in a particular place? And of course, what freedoms are people actually enjoying?
And what's fascinating is, like, you see this disconnect. There are a lot of countries where, on paper, they have all the mechanisms of democracy. They've got the elections, they've got the laws. But then you look a little deeper and people don't really seem to trust it.
Yeah, and it was a huge election year, too, or 2024. I mean,
Yeah.
over half the world's population went to the polls, and we saw a real backlash against people in power, a lot of incumbents losing. And at the same time, this surge in support for populist movements, right? So there's this tension, this really interesting tension between these institutions, these democratic institutions that are in place, and this lack of trust. So where do we start? Where do we start with this big picture? What did the report show? What were the big trends?
Well, I mean, the global average score on the index actually went down a little bit in 2024. But the important thing is where those drops happened. Primarily in countries that are already classified as authoritarian regimes. And it seems like those regimes are actually, doubling down, becoming more entrenched. And that raises a question, are we seeing authoritarianism sort of solidifying globally?
And that's really scary if that's the case. And you see that too with fewer countries overall being classified as democracies in 2024 than in 2023, right? There were 3 fewer democracies.
Yeah, and while there was a slight increase, one more country made it to the full democracy category, bringing that total up to 25. The number of flawed democracies actually went down by 4, leaving it at 46.
Yeah.
And that kind of suggests that this middle ground is shifting and not necessarily in the good direction. Some of these countries might be tilting towards authoritarianism.
One of the things that jumped out at me from the report was that the lowest average score globally was for the functioning of government. Now, that seems pretty fundamental, right? What aspects of how governments are working or not working are pulling that score down, do you think?
Well, I mean, the report doesn't get into like super specifics on every single country, but you can kind of see some common threads. You think about things like corruption, right? How efficient are public services? How responsive are they to people's needs? You've got the judiciary. How independent is it? How effective? And how well are the executive and legislative branches actually able to cooperate? It seems that across the board, there are these weaknesses in these really core functions of government. And that, I think, is definitely eroding people's trust.
And then you see this slight decline in political participation, right?
Right.
The score went down. Does that mean people are just, I don't know, giving up? Are they getting frustrated and just throwing in the towel?
It could be, right? If people feel like their vote doesn't matter, like they're not actually being heard by the people in power, then why bother? They might just check out of the whole process,
Yeah.
And that could be a symptom of that broader dissatisfaction we're talking about.
What's interesting, though, is that political culture actually saw a marginal improvement globally. But the report then kind of throws a curveball and mentions this generational divide. Apparently, younger people are a little more open to non-democratic alternatives. And then if you look at the long-term trends since 2008, political culture overall has actually been declining, So maybe this little uptick in 2024, maybe that's just, I don't know, a blip.
A blip in a downward trend, yeah.
Yeah, a blip. So, okay, let's get specific. Let's talk regions. What really jumped out at you from Western Europe?
Well, Western Europe is still like the strongest democratic region in the world, and it's the only one that actually improved its score a little bit. And it's also where you find the most, full democracies. Portugal even got bumped up to full democracy status, and their economic recovery and the improvements in how the government's functioning and a more positive political culture all seem to have played a role.
That's a nice little bright spot.
Yeah, it is.
But even in Western Europe, the report mentions low levels of political interest, even though people are, willing to protest. It's almost like they're ready to make their voices heard, but not necessarily engage in the day-to-day stuff of politics.
Yeah, it's interesting.
How about North America? What's going on over there?
North America's score stayed the same, but it's still behind Western Europe.
Hmm.
Canada held on to its full democracy status, which is interesting because there were some concerns in the past about how the government was functioning.
Yeah.
They mentioned Justin Trudeau's resignation, maybe hinting that, things might be changing politically there. But the U.S. is still a flawed democracy. And the report highlights these same problems that keep coming up. Low trust in institutions, the political gridlock, economic inequality, and just a lack of basic agreement on social and political values. I mean, it makes you wonder if this polarization is just baked in now, Is it a permanent part of the U.S. political landscape?
In 2024, there was high voter turnout in the U.S. election, but the report points out that a lot of people still didn't vote. And the two main candidates for president, they both had pretty low approval ratings. It's like people felt like they had to vote, but weren't exactly thrilled about the choices.
Right.
And that polarization, it's obviously having an effect on how the government can function. And that, I think, leads to this paralysis that we see so often.
Like a standstill.
A stare still, yeah, exactly. And while civil liberties, the scores for that stayed pretty much the same, the report does mention some potential risks, with the second Trump presidency. Things like the role of the military, immigration policies, reproductive rights, and even concerns about the justice system being used for political reasons. They bring up some of those past controversies, so it raises some big questions about how resilient democratic norms really are, especially when there's such deep divisions.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
So let's shift gears and go south to Latin America and the Caribbean. The report, it sounds a little bleak for that region.
Yeah, it's not great. What's really worrying is that the average democracy score has been going down for 9 years in a row. 9 years. And it's also, considered the most unequal and violent region in the world. And there seems to be this trend, and it's a worrying one, where voters are willing to give up some of those democratic checks and balances if it means a chance at a better life, a better standard of living, more security.
Right.
It shows you that democracy, it's not just about these ideals. It also has to deliver for people, right? It has to produce tangible results.
The report uses El Salvador under Nayib Bukele and Mexico under Andrés Manuel López Obrador as examples, right?
Yeah.
Those countries are now classed as hybrid regimes, and it's almost like people are making this pragmatic calculation,
Yeah, a trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, maybe I have to give up some of my democratic rights, but at least, things might get better for me. And there are other concerning signs too, right? Like the Supreme Court in Brazil and their actions related to social media, which raised questions about the balance of power. And then there was that alleged coup plot in Brazil, and the fact that some people in the military are still skeptical of civilian rule. All of that just highlights how fragile these democratic institutions really are.
It's a reminder that things can change very quickly.
Yeah. How about Eastern Europe and Central Asia? What's happening there? It sounds kind of like a mixed bag.
Yeah, it is. There's some good news. The Czech Republic and Estonia are now full democracies.
Yeah.
And that's a positive development, especially after so long where nothing seemed to be moving in the right direction in that region. But then you have Romania getting downgraded to a hybrid regime after that annulled presidential election, and because public trust in the government is declining. So it shows that progress, it's not always a straight line,
Definitely not.
The report also talks about Russia's influence, especially in Georgia with that foreign agents law and the very close and disputed election in Moldova. And meanwhile, in Central Asia, authoritarian rule is still the norm. And there's very little movement towards democracy.
So over in Asia and Australasia, it sounds like things are moving in the wrong direction overall.
Yeah, I'd say so. South Korea got downgraded to a flawed democracy, which is a big deal. It makes you wonder what's causing even relatively well-established democracies to weaken. And the report is also concerned about dynastic politics in Southeast Asia, where power tends to stay within a few families, and the growing use of religion and caste in politics in South Asia, particularly in Bangladesh and India. And those are the kinds of things that can really undermine the principles of, equal participation, equal representation.
How about sub-Saharan Africa?
There was a little bit of a setback there, democratically speaking. Now, on the plus side, there weren't any successful coups in 2024, which, compared to recent years, that's good news. But in some countries, the military's power has actually grown. It's become more consolidated. And you had this mixed bag of elections some peaceful transfers of power, like in Senegal and South Africa, which is encouraging. But then you also had situations where incumbents clung to power through, less than democratic means. Mozambique's a good example.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
And the increasing use of internet shutdowns and restrictions on protests, that's worrying. It's like civic space is shrinking,
Right.
and in the Sahel region, the military is still firmly in control.
So last but not least, the Middle East and North Africa. Still at the bottom of the democracy index.
Still at the bottom. And still the only region without a single full democracy. It continued to decline in 2024. Now here's an interesting one. Kuwait. They actually reversed their democratic traditions and suspended elections. And what's really strange is that some people actually supported that move because they were so frustrated with the gridlock in parliament. And that's an important point, right? When political systems don't work, when they're dysfunctional, people start to question even democratic norms.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
The report does mention a possible, maybe a chance for a democratic opening in Syria now that the Ba'athist regime has fallen. But that's a long shot. There's a lot of risk involved. And Israel is still the only flawed democracy in the region. And they've got their own set of complicated political and social issues.
So looking at all these regions, I mean, it's obviously very complex and in many ways pretty worrying. What does the report say are the main reasons for this dissatisfaction with democracy? Like, what's at the root of it all?
They point to three main things. First, there's just less trust in government. People don't trust institutions as much. Second, people feel like politicians and parties don't actually represent them, that they're not listening to their concerns. And third, there's this growing sense that people don't have a voice. It's what they call a civic and representation deficit.
So let's talk about that trust issue first. The report uses data from the Pew Research Center and Gallup, right?
Exactly. And what's interesting is that globally, by and large, people still believe in democracy. But there's this growing dissatisfaction with how it's actually working, especially in those richer democracies, the high and middle income countries. And the report gives some specific examples like the UK, South Korea, Canada, where satisfaction has really dropped. And then in some countries like Chile, South Africa, Colombia, Peru, dissatisfaction is already really high. So it makes you think, what exactly is going wrong? What's causing this erosion of trust?
And then there's this idea of a party deficit, right? What does that mean?
Well, traditionally, political parties, especially those on the center left, like the Social Democratic and Labor parties, they've always been really connected to specific groups in society, right? Like industrial workers or local communities. But over time, these parties, they've become more professionalized. They rely more on state funding, and their traditional base, those groups they used to represent, they become more fragmented. So now there's this disconnect between the parties and the people they're supposed to represent. And then you throw in these culture war issues, and it's more complicated. It's like the old political maps don't really work anymore.
And then the report talks about an ideas deficit. It sounds like there's just not a lot of inspiring visions for the future out there,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There's this tendency towards technocratic governance, like just managing things, putting out fires, finding technical solutions. But there's not a lot of big picture thinking, long-term goals, ideologies that really resonate with people. And then there's been this move towards depoliticizing certain areas of policymaking, giving more power to independent institutions like central banks, unelected experts. And while that might bring in some expertise, it can also make people feel like these important decisions are being made without any democratic accountability.
And the last piece, the citizenship deficit, what is that exactly?
It's that feeling that people aren't really participants in their own societies anymore. They're not active citizens. They're just, receiving government services, or they're stakeholders in the economy. And that can make people feel alienated from the political process, like they don't have a real voice. And it also connects to things like inequality and corruption, right? When people see that the system isn't fair, that the people in power are just looking out for themselves, it just reinforces that belief that democracy isn't really working.
So this all brings us back to this really fundamental question. What does democracy even mean, right? And how do we measure it? It's not a simple question, is it?
Yeah, there were different ways of thinking about democracy. Some people, they have this minimalist view. They focus on elections, free and fair elections, and that's it. But others, like the EIU, they take a broader view. They look at elections, but also things like civil liberties, political culture, how much people are participating.
And the EIU's index, like we said at the beginning, it uses that broader definition, right? It looks at those 5 key areas. And based on how a country scores, they classify them into one of 4 different types of regimes. Can you remind us what those are again?
Sure. So you've got full democracies, which score above 8 out of 10, and then flawed democracies, which are between 6 and 8, and they've got, some issues. Then you've got hybrid regimes, which score between 4 and 6. Those are kind of a mix of democracy and authoritarianism. And then at the bottom, you've got authoritarian regimes, which score below 4, and, they don't have a lot of democratic freedoms.
So to sum it all up, what we've seen in this deep dive into the EIU's 2024 Democracy Index is that there's this real tension between people's desire for democracy, which is still strong, and how it's actually working, which, in a lot of cases, it's not great. And that's why you see this dissatisfaction, this sense that something's not working. It's not that people have given up on democracy, but they're definitely frustrated.
Yeah. And the report, it's not meant to be depressing. It's more like it's a call to action. It's saying that we shouldn't give up on representative democracy. We need to work to make it better.
Yeah.
To fix those core issues of trust, representation, make sure that people can participate in a meaningful way. We need to make democracy work for people again.
So that brings us to our final thought for you, for all of you listening. We've talked about these global trends, these specific challenges that the report highlights. So what do you think? What are the biggest threats to democracy today? And what are the most promising ways forward, both globally and maybe even in your own community? There's a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
For more videos, don't forget to subscribe and like the videos.